Guys, we've got a brand new Team Corally Kagama on the bench, and today we're going to be turning this into the ultimate basher using all of this. We have got parts from ADU Racing, we've got a Team Corally awesome servo here, M2C towers, a beautiful 7075 chassis, and a bunch of other parts. The Kagama is one of the most durable and fun RC cars you can buy, and in today's market of a nearly $800 Traxxas Sledge represents really great value for money. For a long time, you really couldn't get very many upgrade parts for Team Corally cars, but that's changed in recent times, and I'm really excited to see just how tough we can make this truck. Speaking of tough, we're also going to be trying this dragon skin from RC Body Armor. They say this stuff is supposed to be as strong as drywall tape and E6000. I'm skeptical, but really curious to find out. Since we're going to be doing a chassis replacement, this is going to have to be completely stripped down. Let's go ahead and pull the modules apart first. This is going to be pretty straightforward. First thing we need to do is just remove this body support. We'll just flip that back out of the way, and then remove these two bolts to disconnect the tower-to-tower brace from the center module. And now it's pretty much just a matter of removing every one of these screws from the chassis. And that's just a matter of starting from the front and working your way back. These Kagamas are already pretty well equipped from the factory. You can see they've got CNC machined A, B, C, and D blocks, as well as a lot of other really nice bits and pieces. An easy way to keep track of your screws when you're doing a big project like this is just to put them back in the parts they came from. And then once you have all the screws out for a particular module, you just lift it up and get it out of the way. The machined spiral bevel gears on these Team Corally car differentials are already really good, but we're going to be adding aluminum housings and an aluminum bulkhead to really strengthen things up. When you take a front or rear module off, there's always going to be some grease left behind. Go ahead and wipe that up, otherwise it's going to end up everywhere. I also like to line up all the screws in the order they came out of the chassis. However, you'll almost always end up bumping these, so take a picture of it so you can reference it later. Keeping things neat, clean, and organized really will help with reassembly. It'll obviously be a little bit more time-consuming in the beginning, but you will save that time in the long run. We're going to be replacing a lot of parts on this car, but we're going to be keeping these stock electronics because they're actually really good. And with that, the rest of the electronics come out, and we're getting pretty close here. If you're planning on doing a big upgrade like this, it's often best to do it when the car is still brand new. And that's because some of these stock parts can actually be worth a decent amount of money. For instance, this chassis, brand new on eBay, is worth about $60. Once it's used and scratched up, it's basically worth nothing. I think a lot of people would be surprised at how much money you can recoup by selling off new stock parts. The stock parts on this truck aren't worth quite as much as they would be on an Arrma or Traxxas, but I can still probably get about $125 back with these stock parts. And with that, the strip down is complete. Let's start upgrading. All right, let's start off with the front module. We've got a lot of parts to upgrade on this, and I'm really excited to see what it's gonna look like when it's done. This thing should look absolutely amazing, and it should perform quite a bit better than it does stock. First thing we're going to address are these shocks. And to do that, we've got this Zero Rebound System Complete kit from M2C. This kit is currently a prototype, but I expect it to be available fairly soon. Now, the Zero Rebound System changes the way that these shocks actually work. And to explain how that works, let me explain to you the two main types of shock systems in RC cars. Most RTR RC cars are going to be known as bladder type shocks, and that means they've got this dome in the cap of the shock absorber. That dome serves two purposes. One, it's the seal between the cap and the body of the shock absorber, but two, that dome can compress. The reason we need that dome to be able to compress is when this shock shaft goes into the shock body, it actually takes up space inside the shock. And you can see, if you look at the level of the shock oil with it all the way extended, and then the level of the shock oil with it all the way compressed, that level actually goes up. Because this fluid is incompressible, when that shaft goes in and takes up that space, you need something to be able to accommodate that additional volume, and that's what this bladder does. The advantage to this is that you can run without any air in the system. The disadvantage is this bladder tends to hold air behind it and creates kind of a bouncing effect on rebound. Many racing RC cars use what's known as an emulsion style cap, and as you can see, there is no bladder in here, and instead we just have a simple seal that goes in here. The term emulsion comes from the concept that this is designed to have some air in it. This does have a bleeder to let you get most of the air out of it, and I'll show you how to do that in just a minute, but some air stays in here, and as the shock is operated up up and down the first few times when you're using it, that air mixes in with the oil and becomes what's known as an emulsion. That creates a fairly consistent shock feel and reduces that rebound effect that you get from the bladder style caps. To improve on that even further, we have these special shock pistons that use these little O-rings. These O-rings serve two different purposes. One, they seal against the side of the shock body. Two, we have these little slots in the shock piston. These little slots interact with the O-ring and actually create a different amount of rebound, improving the feeling of the shocks. Installation of this kit is very simple and does not require complete disassembly of the shock. Just get one of these little 4-way wrenches, remove the nut. The nut will usually stick in the 4-way wrench, just leave it in there. Then you just need to fish this piston out. You can do that by pushing the shock shaft down and then pushing up on the piston. There is a washer underneath it that you need to pay attention to and make sure stays on the shock shaft. You can see the washer came off with the piston. That's fine. Just install it back on the shock shaft. And then we just install the new piston with those slots facing down and reinstall the nut. Once that's installed, put the shock shaft all the way down, top off the shock with a little bit of fluid. You want that as close to the top as possible. Put your new shock cap on. Get that snug as you can by hand. And then we're going to bleed out as much of the air as possible. We're going to do that just by taking this bleeder screw out, pushing the shock shaft up, and then putting the bleeder screw right back in again. And with that, this is done, and this should be quite a bit better of a system than the original bladder style. Now to do the other one. Because these are emulsion style shocks, you really don't need to worry about letting it sit to get all the air out of it, because the point is to have some air in it anyway. And there we go, 2 upgraded shocks. We've got a lot more upgrades to do to transform this front end. Let's get to it. Before you remove these upper hinge pins, make sure you loosen these little retaining grub screws. Otherwise, you might damage the threads. These stock Kagama A, B, C, and D blocks are actually pretty nice machined aluminum, but we've got some 7075 ones from M2C Racing, so we're going to upgrade to those. One place I would like to see the aftermarket step up are on these front CVDs. These stock ones are pretty good, but upgrades would be really nice to see. Now we've got a choice between the M2C Beefcake shock tower, the M2C carbon fiber shock tower, and the 7075 Team Corally shock towers to put on this. While I finish taking this apart, let me know down in the comments which one you want to see. And while you're at it, why don't you go ahead and get subscribed? You can see one of the design elements that really makes this system so strong. You have this center brace, tower to chassis brace, and shock tower all tied very tightly in together, and they use a lot of screws to hold everything in place. With this tower removed, you can see just how much beef there is behind it supporting it. Before we get into this differential, let's upgrade the steering. And we're going to do that with this 7075 steering rack and stiffener. Interestingly, the 6061 stock version appears to be pretty beefed up compared to the 7075 version. I'm curious to see how this thing holds up to some bashing. I'm also curious to know what you think about the Team Corally Kagama and other Team Corally cars in general. I know that their original first generation bashers weren't the best in the world, and they had some improvements they needed to make, but at least to me it seems like they've really made a lot of those improvements, and my personal opinion is that these represent some of the best value you can get in bashing today, and I'm actually making this to be my new personal daily basher. While we're down here, I'm going to go ahead and tighten up this adjustable servo saver a little bit. I'm tightening this up because we're going to be using a pretty awesome looking servo, and that's this top of the line Corally unit. I've never used any of these higher end TC servos, so I'm really interested to see what this thing looks like inside and how it performs. Stick around, we're going to be taking this apart before we put it in. Whenever you tighten up a servo saver, be aware that you are increasing the risk of damaging your servo as a trade-off for improved steering response. All right, let's go ahead and get this bulkhead swapped out. You can see the nice machined spiral bevel gears that they include on this Kagama from the factory. Before we install this differential in the new bulkhead, I do want to go ahead and swap out this plastic differential housing for this 7075 aluminum one. We aren't doing this upgrade just because it looks cool. One of the main ways that gears get stripped is from misalignment, and the stronger we can make the parts that hold the gears in place, the less likely it is that we'll have that misalignment that causes gears to strip. Usually you can take these pieces out all as one little unit, and if you set them down carefully, you can put them in the new housing without actually taking anything apart. These inner side gears can be pretty challenging to remove. A dental pick lets you get in behind them and pull them out, which really helps. Once you've got them partway out, you can usually just knock them out. and they'll fall right out. These dental picks are also great for getting the cross pins in and out. And now we just need to load up the new one. Be very careful when you're doing this that you don't get differential fluid on the threads of the screw holes. If you get differential fluid down in those threads, it's going to prevent the thread lock from working properly. And don't forget to put your bearing on the outside before you put the output cup on. I've done that plenty of times, and it's really annoying to have to completely disassemble the differential to put that back on later. And again, if you're really careful, you can take this entire assembly out and put it back in without having to disturb any of the gears or the shims. Don't forget to add plenty of thread locker to your screws. Now for the moment of truth, how does it all fit in the bulkhead? That feels good so far. Got a little bit of side-to-side play even with the shims in there. However, it feels nice and snug on the gear without any binding, so I think that's actually going to be pretty good. Spins nice and smooth and very minimal play. I think that's just about right. Now keep in mind, my result might not equal your result. Depending on what parts you're using and the tolerance stack up, you may need to adjust the shimming on your differential to get it to fit perfectly, but at least in this case, the stock setup works really well. The only thing left to do now is to put it all back together. Okay guys, time to put the tower on. Let me check the comments and see which one you chose. Team Corally in the front and M2C in the rear. That's a pretty interesting choice, but I'll go with it. Time to get these shocks installed. We're going to be trying out these ADU racing shock mounts. I'll have a full separate video reviewing all these ADU racing parts. Make sure you check that out when you're done with this one. One benefit of these shock mounts over the stock ones is if you bend or break the mount, you're probably just going to be bending or breaking this bolt, and these bolts are cheap and plentiful. All right, we'll see if these hold up better than the stock ones to some abuse. And with that, guys, the front end is done, and I think it looks really, really awesome. The rear end is basically going to be the same as the front end, so we'll just... And it's done. Let's take a break from building and check out some of this dragon skin. According to the instructions, this is pretty easy to apply. Just need to cut it out and stick it on the body, then use a heat gun to make sure it sticks better. They do say this is not waterproof. That might be a problem for me because I wash my cars pretty frequently, so that's something we're going to have to test here in just a few minutes. One of the biggest considerations for something like this is how easy it is to apply. Let's see how this stuff goes. Okay, already the backing is a little bit challenging to remove. Okay, so you need to be really careful when you remove the backing. This stuff likes to curl up and I just ruined this piece. So far that feels pretty straightforward to apply. It's fairly thin, so it conforms nicely. Well guys, I think that's about as good as it's going to get for this body. This stuff's fairly tricky to apply. It's kind of hard to get off the backing, and it really, really likes to stick to itself, but we'll just have to see how it holds up to some bashing and that washing they tell us not to do. It's just about time for final assembly and then bashing. Before we do that, I want to add some thicker center differential fluid. When you thicken the center differential fluid, keep in mind you're going to be altering how the car handles. The thicker the center differential fluid, the better it will do wheelies, but the more likely it is that you're going to have trouble turning under acceleration. I'm just going to scoop a little bit of this stock 100K out of here, and then shove in a little bit of silicone earplug to replace it. The earplug will mix with the fluid that's in there, and it'll probably end up around 10 million, which is just where I want it. One thing to note that, at least in my experience, the viscosity of the fluid you put in does not result in a linear increase in differential stiffness. For instance, 10 million weight in a differential will not make it 100 times stiffer than 100K. One thing I didn't upgrade anything on was this motor mount and center module. At least in my experience, this is a really good unit and does not need to be upgraded. That's a great start. Now, before we install the rest of the electronics, let's address this servo. This stock servo is actually one of the better RTR servos you can get, but this being an ultimate build, I definitely want to do better. And it doesn't get any better from Team Corally than this CS5245. This servo's got some pretty impressive specs, especially given that it's not a brushless servo. Let's take a look inside. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, I think you're awesome, and I want to show you my appreciation. To do that, I want to give away one of these OC27 Team Corally servos. This thing should be pretty sweet as well, and if you want to win it, just make sure you're subscribed, like this video, and then make a comment using the keyword servo. I'm definitely curious to see how these things are constructed. They look really nice from the outside, but we definitely don't want to judge a book by its cover. Everything looks pretty standard. We do have a sealed bearing here, which is really nice to see. These gears are all steel and they do look very high quality. We've got an O-ring here, which should seal this nicely. However, we do not have O-rings on the screws, which means this is not going to be completely waterproof, but it should be pretty water resistant. Now we'll just pop open the bottom. And we can see we've got a board that covers the entire thing, and the motor is directly soldered to the board. This is a pretty good design. We've even got some silicone on here for strain relief, and we can see we have an O-ring for water sealing. Overall, looks like a pretty decent servo for the price, but looks can be deceiving, so let's get this in the car and see how it actually performs. All right, guys, final assembly time. Let's put on the front, the rear, battery and ESC tray, servo and receiver mount, skid plates, and side pods, which I'm definitely not gonna have to take that battery tray back out to install. I'm actually not going to install this stock front bumper. We're gonna be installing this ADU Racing one instead. I could install it on top of it. However, there'd be quite the gap between here and this bumper. And without 3D printing something to fill that gap, I'm not really comfortable with that. I'm a little bit skeptical about whether or not this is gonna survive heavy bashing, but it still should provide about the same protection, so we'll see. All right, guys, we've got the front bumper, ABCD blocks, bulkheads, shocks, shock towers, servo, battery straps, fan for the motor, and a bunch of other small upgrades done to this car. Let's get some tires on it. I want to see how it performs. Alright guys, I've got a few packs of hard bashing through this now, and I finally was able to break it. I'll show you that in a minute, but how did everything else hold up? My 3D printed wing mount broke almost immediately, but the M2C shock caps and shock mounts are doing really, really well, as is the M2C shock tower. All the stock parts in the middle are doing well. I'm pretty happy with this servo, seems plenty powerful enough and pretty strong. In the front end, the Team Corally 7075 tower is doing well, along with the upper shock mounts from ADU Racing. Speaking of ADU Racing, that ADU Racing bulkhead's holding up just fine, and surprisingly, the ADU Racing front bumper is still hanging in there. The chassis is still perfectly flat, which to me is pretty impressive given the hits that it took, which brings us to the part that actually broke. And this is something I've never broken before, but I popped one of the pillow balls out of the arm and broke the end of the arm off. The dragon skin held up really well, even though I did wash this one time. I'm not sure it's gonna hold up to repeated washing simply because this is a mesh and water can get behind it, but it seems to be fine with incidental water. So that leads me to the most controversial part of this video, but before we talk about that, make sure you make a comment to enter into the giveaway, and don't forget to use that keyword we talked about earlier. So, why do I think this is the world's best basher? Is it the fastest thing in the world? No. Is it the most durable car in the world? No. Is it the best handling car in the world? No. But it does provide a great combination of all of those things at what I think is a very fair price point. After coupon, this falls between the BLX and the EXB Arrma Kratons. I think it's stronger than the BLX Kraton, and I think in some ways out of the box it's even stronger than the EXB Kraton, and with a few upgrades bringing it closer to that EXB Kraton price, you can make this a very durable car. It has probably the world's best out-of-the-box power system with lots of power and a good amount of durability, and overall it's just a fun car. That's just my opinion though. Your opinion's gonna be different, and if there's one thing I've learned in this hobby, it's that everybody's experience is going to be different. But if you haven't experienced one of these before and you want to, I'd say give it a try. And then why don't you go ahead and experience one of these videos?